Hello, Representative Moscoso. I'm so glad that you're with us. And let me introduce you. Representative Luis Moscoso is from the 1st District in Shoreline, and he's the prime sponsor of the Voting Rights Act in the House. I really admire Representative Moscoso because he has the ability to take a principled position that is ahead of its popularity and follow it patiently through this session after session, refining it and building support until suddenly, like a miracle, it's an idea whose time has come. Without courageous legislators like Representative Moscoso, very few necessary changes would ever happen. Thank you so much. Um, Unitarian Universalist, you may not know, were developing as a religion at the same time as our democracy was developing. So there were reciprocal influences. Some, such as our second and sixth president, were both Unitarians and had a lot of influence. So naturally, we value democracy very highly. The right to self-determination is a key value. So I'd like to ask you to briefly describe the Voting Rights Act. What does it do, and how does it do it?
Thank you, Jalinda. I really appreciate having the opportunity to speak to you and to the folks who will be listening to this taping. And as you said before, the Unitarian Universalists are bringing a lot of their history, a lot of their commitment into their social justice work and legislation. And I feel the same way. I mean, just to be clear to folks who don't know me, I'm the son of a Peruvian immigrant who came to this country after the Second World War from a fairly active political family in Peru. My mother is fourth generation, mostly German heritage, who moved to Iowa back before the Civil War. So I was born and raised there, went to school there. I consider myself the fifth generation Hawkeye. And it's funny coming to Washington State, just to tell you a little bit about my own motivation, that I know growing up in the 50s and 60s, particularly in Iowa, where there wasn't a lot of diversity, I never went through the same kinds of problems that a lot of folks did during that period in larger cities. But coming to Washington State, it was interesting that all of a sudden I had to fit into some stereotypical box, whether that was from a liberal white community who wanted to thank me or praise me because I speak English so well when it was my only language growing up, and also wanting to sort of, empathize with whatever hardships I had growing up as a farm worker. Well, I was not a farm worker, but I actually did work on farms in Iowa. My dad, who sold insurance to farmers, would loan my brother and I out for free for our own edification. So I have some understanding of family farms. Coming to Washington State and getting involved with the Voting Rights Act as a legislator, this is my third term. Will be my fourth year prime sponsoring this bill. And it is frustrating to see the difficulties in getting it passed, because one thing that I've learned in the last 4 years, and for an increasing number of visits I've been making around the state, some very quietly, to cities in eastern Washington where council people there have asked me to come off the record and talk about things, they're getting a lot of misperceptions what the bill really does. And particularly when they use the excuse that somehow this is a bill that's going to bring more litigation. What people have to understand is that our voting systems, for the most part, in communities where the demographics have changed over the decades, that they may not have been drawn in order to hurt, protected classes, but the outcome now is that they can and they have been, as we know from the situation in Yakima. And that's one of the reasons why I've been invited out there, because they found out that I wasn't there to beat people up. I'm there to help them develop a voting system that's more relevant and engages all of the citizens in their community. So
what's the mechanism?
Well, first of all, we're not going to go into a lot of details here, so because you can get out in the weeds. Simply put, a person who has standing in that community and can demonstrate that there is racially polarized voting, as we saw in in Yakima, where these Latino communities over the decades who have been voting and in recent examples have been able to elect people in a primary to go on to city council races. This could be true of other jurisdictions, but in this case it's cities, that they can never win in a general election that allows voting by the whole community. If your district voting, is washed out in a general election by the larger majority, then those communities never have someone speaking for them. That's what the federal court agreed with. They didn't even hear the case because it was so egregious that they just granted the decision to the plaintiffs prior to even wasting time in trial. Yet the city of Yakima spent upwards of $3 million trying to defend themselves for something that in the end was completely indefensible. So what I've tried to tell these folks that I'm talking to, these city councils and other community leaders, is that the state of Washington, Olympia, the Democratic Party, or anybody else is not going to come out there and look at what you have. Someone in your community has to feel that there is an injustice going on. We have to have the data to demonstrate that, and that all the bill does is allow you to have the tools to, at first, mediate a solution that works for the community and for the jurisdiction. If you don't come up to an agreement, then you can go to a local state court and still have this thing settled that way, much cheaper. And for those people who are especially concerned with the federal courts or federal government getting involved in their life, here's a perfect way to do things locally. If there's anything else in the bill that might satisfy their needs to sort of fine-tune this, we have made a number of concessions. We feel we're just about out of any other concessions that we could offer and still make the bill meaningful.
Okay, thank you. I think I was going to ask you why we need it in liberal Washington, but I think you've covered that well enough. So what do you think its chances are this time?
It's hard to judge because having gotten it, through the House 3 years in a row, having gotten it out of Senate committee the last 2 years and into rules, you would think that we're pretty close to passing it. I believe that we have the votes in the Washington State Senate to pass it, but I believe that the so-called majority coalition over there is not letting it go to the floor. We had a tie vote in the Rules Committee to get it out last year, and I feel that that it's being held back primarily for political reasons because, and I get this, that some legislators from Eastern Washington, some senators from Eastern Washington, don't know how to go back and explain this to their communities who feel that somehow they're going to be losing something. And as long as they can use an excuse that somehow this is more of a litigious bill than it is a solution for a problem, people will be willing to believe that rather than think about what's really going on in their communities. So we need to think about how, answer those questions already, what's different about this that we can get it passed this year. What will make it more difficult is that it's an election year in 2016. And I believe that for those people who might be so willing to use it as a wedge issue, and that could be from the right or the left, because the frustration in not passing this bill when we know we need it, and the fact that, like the City Council of Pasco has asked for a bill to let them change their voting system already, but they're not allowed under the current law because of the kind of city they are. We need to help them. They know they need to change. So how do we do that?
Okay, thank you. So the folks in Spokane area and in the Yakima area who are listening to this, watching this video, you need to talk to your senators, especially.
Absolutely.
We were talking before we started filming about the Public Safety Committee that you sit on, and about the Black Lives Matter leadership and Campaign Zero, which took the needs that Black Lives Matter assessed and put it into a policy program. to end police violence and bring equity to the criminal justice system. So you were telling me that all of the bills are not, except for the ones that were introduced last year or perhaps even years before, um, the new bills you are still in the formation stage, and you're going to send us an email when some of that shapes up. But the other thing that we talked about was the need for white privilege training, and you see that need just within your own Democratic caucus. So, are there ways that individual Unitarian Universalists and Unitarian Universalist Voices for Justice can speak up and support the idea?
Yes, I think so, and it should be I think rather easy. Not only just looking at the legislation, but looking at other issues here. You know, when President Obama was in Oregon a few weeks ago after that shooting, there was all those demonstrations down there, people telling him to go home. And then there was a lot of articles you can easily find in the media about how Portland has become the whitest city, large city in the United States. I understand Seattle's number 2, that people of color are moving out because of the affordability. This speaks to, you know, racial equity and opportunity for advancement, how these things are happening. And I think that white folks have just got to understand that the demographics of the country are changing. And even though we happen to live in an area where the dynamism of our economy here, the tech industry, is pretty white. And so where the rest of the country is changing, the demographics in this state are certainly changing also. We have to ask ourselves, who has the privilege, and how do we make sure that the privilege isn't keeping other people from having an opportunity to move ahead? The challenge I've had, you know, in the legislature, not just in my caucus, but it's always more awkward when your own friends who are liberal, you know, don't get it, is that, you know, coming from Iowa like I did, I never, you know, had a minority mentality or attitude until people expected that out of me. So yes, I am doing these things because I believe in them, but it's not because I have a history of prejudice and discrimination that I had to fight through. I've had a rather privileged life, and I believe that if I had my mother's German last name and looked more German rather than Hispanic, that I would be doing the same things. But because of the way I look and the way I talk, well, then people assume that I fit this other stereotype. Those stereotypes don't work anymore. So I believe that your organization and others can reach out, can be effective in trying to use this idea of racial equity. How is the system we have, not just the voting system, but our educational system, opportunity gap, these things we've heard about, how does all of that inform us about making sure that the next generation growing up, which will be much more diverse, and we will not have a white majority in this country in about 20 or 30 years, that what does this tell us about the language you use, the kind of terminology? And for those of us who have been activists since the 60s, the rhetoric we use in describing this particular dialogue we're having right now, how does that help us? You know, I happen to have the good fortune of actually speaking with Bernie Sanders just a few hours after the Black Lives Matter incident in Seattle, because I was introducing him that evening at Heck Ed. And we had quite a chat in the locker room before that. So I know how Bernie feels about it, and I feel that a lot of the pushback I heard from that afternoon meeting, including friends of mine who were down at the rally. I was not there. I was writing my speech at the time. I had friends texting me from the rally talking about their white friends at the Westlake there saying some pretty nasty, you know, things to the black women up there. And I couldn't believe it at first that there'd be that much pushback because of their feeling about Bernie. And the funny thing was, that was a social security rally. You know, I had been invited to speak a month earlier, and I turned it down because I was supposed to be on vacation that week. that weekend, and I was packing to leave on the day before, Friday, when I got a call from the Sanders campaign asking me would I speak and introduce him because of the Voting Rights Act and his interest in voting rights in this country. So I unpacked the car, I sat down and stayed 2 more days to write the speech and do that. And I'm glad it happened, not because I got to introduce Bernie, but because it put me right in the middle of this discussion about, how do we address Black Lives Matter and the issues of people of color and trying to get racial equity and opportunity in this country. And I thank you for the work that you've done, your organization. I believe our stakeholders going forward next year in the legislature need to spend some time working with that also and ask our caucuses, all 4 of them, not just my Democratic caucus in the House. So what is your understanding of racial equity? And is that a useful tool for us to evaluate the legislation going forward? Senator Hasagawa has introduced some legislation to that effect to at least look at this as it relates to some of the agencies. That bill went nowhere in the Senate and doesn't even have a companion in the House, although I'm going to talk to him about perhaps doing it next year myself if I can find the time. But if I can't do it, somebody's got to do it. So I would say thank you for your question, and if you can work with Senator Hasagawa and I on how we can have a legislative and political discussion about the application of these values, I would look forward to that.
Great. And I recall when that bill was being discussed, there were a lot of senators that were just incredibly nonplussed. They simply had no idea what to do with the idea of doing racial impact statements on bills when requested.
Right.
And yes, we need to step up more. And I have been very, very privileged to be able to lobby as a part of the racial equity team, which always puts a racial equity lens on it. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate your perspective.
Well, thank you. We're still trying to figure out what our strategy is going forward, because I want to be sure that my colleagues understand that unless we pass this bill, how are we going to evaluate the necessity of political action during the election season to raise the issue? And there will be those who will be eager to do it from the left or right, and there'll be those that say creating a wedge issue just makes it harder for some people to understand it. I would ask my Republican colleagues, let's pass this bill just like we passed the DREAM Act. We can all take credit for doing the right thing, and then we can help those cities and jurisdictions that need to change their voting systems address it in a way that's not going to cost their communities, their constituents money, and it brings everybody into the political system. Thank you, Jolinda.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.